Picture this. It's late 1944. The Allies are riding high after D-Day, pushing across France, and it feels like the war in Europe is just about over. But Adolf Hitler had one last, desperate card to play, an all-or-nothing gamble that would become one of the most iconic battles of World War II.
So you've got to understand, the Allies thought they had this thing in the bag. By December, a kind of dangerous confidence had set in. They looked at the dense, snowy Ardennes forest and saw a quiet sector. A perfect place to let battle-weary troops rest up and give the new guys some experience. They just couldn't imagine the Germans had enough punch left for one more major attack, and that was a massive mistake.
All right, so here's how we're going to break this all down. First, we'll look at Hitler's absolutely audacious plan. Then we'll dive into the shock of that surprise attack. We'll cover the heroic small unit actions that completely wrecked the German timetable, and of course, the legendary siege of Bastogne. After that, we'll see how the Allies finally turned the tide, and we'll finish by looking at the incredible, almost unbelievable cost of it all.
So let's get into it. How on earth did the Allies get caught so completely flat-footed? Well, the answer, ironically, lies in their own incredible success.
See, after breaking out from Normandy, the Allies were moving at lightning speed, but their supply lines were stretched like a rubber band about to snap. They were desperate for a big port like Antwerp to get supplies in, and Hitler saw this vulnerability. He saw that long, thin Allied line and identified the weakest link, the Ardennes. It was the quiet sector, held by a mix of exhausted vets and brand new troops who had never even seen combat.
And the German plan?
Oh, it was a throwback, a classic. They were literally pulling a page from their own 1940 playbook using the exact same tactic, blitzkrieg, the lightning war, through the very same forest. The idea was simple. Punch a hole in the line with overwhelming force, pour tanks and infantry through that hole, and just create absolute chaos in the enemy's rear.
And the goal here was, well, it was breathtakingly ambitious. The plan was to punch through the American lines, race to the Meuse River, then swing north and capture that vital port, Antwerp. This would trap 4 entire Allied armies, cutting them off from all their supplies. Hitler actually believed a blow this massive would shatter the alliance between the US and Britain and maybe even force them to sue for peace.
Okay, but for this whole thing to work, a bunch of things had to go perfectly right. It was a house of cards, really. First, they needed total, complete surprise. Second, they were counting on terrible weather, thick fog, low clouds, snow, to keep the Allied air forces, their single biggest advantage, on the ground. Third, they had to move incredibly fast. And finally, and this is so important, they were running on fumes. The whole plan depended on capturing Allied gas stations, basically, to keep their tanks moving. So you'd think his generals would be on board, right? Nope, not at all. His top commanders on the ground, guys like von Rundstedt and Model, were horrified. They knew Germany's army was a shell of its former self. They told Hitler the plan was a fantasy, that reaching Antwerp is impossible, and that they should aim for something smaller. But Hitler, convinced of his own genius, shut them down. One of his generals famously said, "The plan hasn't got a damn leg to stand on." And so, against the advice of his generals, the plan went ahead. Under the cover of a freezing winter storm, the Germans secretly gathered a massive force. And on December 16, 1944, all hell broke loose in the Ardennes. Imagine being an American GI, half frozen in a foxhole. One minute, it's dead quiet, snow falling. The next, at 5:30 a.m., the world is exploding as 1,600 German guns open up. For 90 minutes, they pounded the American lines. And then, out of the fog, came the tanks and infantry. The surprise was total, and by the end of the first day, the Germans had torn a massive hole in the American front, the Bulge, that gave the battle its name. And let's talk numbers, because they are just brutal. We're talking about 250,000 German soldiers hitting a line held by only about 80,000 Americans, who were spread incredibly thin. In the main points of attack, the GIs were outnumbered 5, even 10 to 1. It was a complete mismatch.
And as if a massive surprise attack wasn't enough, the Germans got tricky. They sent in English-speaking commandos wearing American uniforms to sneak behind the lines. These guys changed road signs, cut telephone wires, and spread wild rumors, creating total paranoia. It got so bad that American sentries started asking everybody trivia questions like, who plays for the Yankees, or what's the capital of Illinois, to try and catch the spy.
So the German plan looked great on paper. Everything was going their way. But, as they say, no plan survives contact with the enemy. The Germans were obsessed with their timetable. Speed was everything, and that timetable was about to be absolutely shredded by the sheer guts of small, isolated American units who refused to break.
Up in the north, you had the Germans' A-Team, the elite 6th SS Panzer Army. Their job was to take the high ground at a place called Elsenborn Ridge, which was the fastest route to their objective. But they ran into an absolute brick wall of American resistance. The U.S. 2nd and 99th Divisions, despite being hit hard, just wouldn't budge. They held the ridge, and that single act may have been the most important defensive stand of the entire battle.
And it wasn't just big divisions holding the line. Sometimes the fate of thousands of men rested on the shoulders of just a few guys. In fact, one of the most incredible stories from this whole conflict boils down to one simple number: 18. Get this, a tiny recon platoon, 18 guys and one lieutenant, dug in on a ridge near a village called Lanzarote. They were attacked by an entire battalion of 500 elite German paratroopers. And those 18 GIs held them off. For almost a full day, that single tiny unit delayed a main German armored column for nearly 20 hours. It was an unbelievable act of courage that threw a massive wrench in the German plan.
And this wasn't a one-off thing. This kind of story was happening all over the place. See, the Ardennes is all hills and forests, so everything depends on the roads. The Germans had to capture key crossroads towns like St. Vith. Their plan said they'd take it in a few hours. Instead, the Americans held on for 5 days, creating huge traffic jams of German tanks that stretched for miles, burning fuel and, more importantly, wasting time.
Okay, so all these little firefights and heroic stands are wrecking the German timetable. But in the center of the Bulge, the German advance was pushing deep, and it flowed right around one critical town, a place that would become legendary, Bastogne.
Think of Bastogne as the hub of a wheel. All the major roads in the area went right through it. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled the region. Simple as that. Realizing this, Eisenhower rushed in his best troops, the 101st Airborne, the Screaming Eagles. They got into the town just hours before the Germans completely surrounded them.
And their situation was, well, it was grim. Totally surrounded, outnumbered, they were running out of everything. Ammo, food, medical supplies. The weather was so bad, no planes could fly in to help them. The Germans were tightening the noose, convinced the Americans were about to break.
So, on December 22nd, the German commander, figuring he's got this in the bag, sends over a couple of officers with a white flag and a note. The message was pretty clear: surrender honorably, or we will wipe you off the map.
The note gets to the American commander, General Anthony McAuliffe. He reads it, and his first reaction is just one word. When his officers try to write up some fancy, formal reply, they realize, you know what? The general's first word was perfect, so they type it up and send it back. The official American reply? A single word? Nuts! The German officers had no idea what it meant, so an American explained, it means go to hell. That reply became an instant legend.
That one word, nuts, it was more than just a reply. It was a symbol. The defiance at Bastogne and all those other small stands had bought the Allies the one thing they desperately needed: time. And now, the sleeping giant was finally waking up.
And leading the charge was none other than General George S. Patton. This guy was something else. Even before the attack, he had a feeling something was up. When the news broke, he was ready. In maybe the greatest logistical move of the war, he literally turned his entire army 90 degrees and sent it racing north through a blizzard to slam into the side of the German attack and rescue the guys in Bastogne.
And if Patton's army was one hammer, the other was about to fall from the sky. On December 23rd, the weather broke. The sun came out, and for the first time in a week, the Allied air forces could fly. It was a slaughter. Thousands of planes hit the skies, bombing German tanks, shooting up supply trucks, and dropping food and ammo to the defenders of Bastogne. By Christmas Eve, the Germans were out of gas just a few miles from their goal. 2 days later, Patton's tanks broke through. The siege was over.
So the German attack was stopped. The siege was broken. But don't think for a second the battle was over. Nope. Now the Allies had to push them back, inch by inch in the freezing cold. And the price for that victory was just staggering.
Just to put this in perspective, this was the biggest battle the U.S. Army has ever been in, period. Look at these numbers. We're talking about almost 81,000 American casualties, 19,000 killed. The Germans lost even more, maybe 100,000 men. But here's the key difference. The Allies could absorb those losses. Germany simply couldn't.
So what was the final verdict? Hitler's last big gamble was a total catastrophic failure. He threw everything he had left into this one punch, his last good tanks, his last experienced soldiers, his last reserves of fuel, and it wasn't enough. After the Battle of the Bulge, the German army in the West was, for all intents and purposes, broken. The war from then on was just a slow, painful retreat back to Berlin.
And it wasn't just Americans who recognized what had happened. Winston Churchill himself made a point to stand up in Parliament and say, hey, let's be clear about something. He made sure everyone knew that this was, first and foremost, an American victory paid for with American blood. So in the end, the Battle of the Bulge actually shortened the war by destroying the last of Hitler's reserves. But it leaves you with this chilling what-if. The German plan was a long shot, but it came so close to working. What if the weather had held for another week? What if Patton had been delayed? What if those 18 guys on Lanzareth Ridge had broken? It's a powerful reminder of how the entire course of history can sometimes turn on the courage of just a few people.